Welcome to Life's About Living. I'm Dr. Page, the best guy to see on the worst day of your life. And I have with me today David Hawley. Now, this is very interesting. David is almost like an American Indiana Jones. And so David is going to tell us a very interesting story about, he's an excavator and he's a treasure hunter in a sense. And he's going to tell us a little bit about an unusual find in a cornfield of all places in Kansas. David, how are you today?
I'm doing well, sir. Thank you very much for inviting me on your show.
Man, it's so glad for you to be here on Life's About Living. Typically when we think of finding a boat, we think about something in the sea. So let's start there. So, David, tell me about how you found a boat in the middle of a Kansas cornfield.
Well, there was back in the day, long ago. This story takes place in the late summer of 1856. When in St. Louis, a steamboat called the Arabia loaded 222 tons of freight heading for the frontier. That, along with about 150 passengers, and it left late August.
Now, where was the frontier at that point?
1856. Well, in our world today, the frontier would have been just pretty near anywhere. But in their day, they considered anything west of really Kansas City. Missouri was a state, became a state in 1821.
Right.
But Kansas and Nebraska were all territory. And so all of that up through there was pretty much wilderness. Wow. People lived up there, but not lots and lots.
Right.
They crossed the, California, all that. A lot of travel the first run of the trip by steamboat. They'd get to Kansas City, maybe Omaha, and then from there, points west go by wagon but steamboats were not only transported passengers, but they carried lots of freight. Steamboats, if you were to compare them in our world today, they would be kind of like a FedEx truck. Okay, you would go,
carry everything on them.
You'd travel to St. Louis, you'd go to the warehouses, you'd pick out the things you wanted for your stores. You'd put them on a wagon, take them down to the boat dock, put them on a steamboat, and a couple weeks later, they'd show up in Omaha, Sioux City, Kansas City, wherever, where.
Now, was this before railroads, David?
Well, there was railroads, but there weren't railroads to Kansas City yet.
Right.
There were railroads to St. Louis. There were railroads to Jefferson City, Missouri, which is about middle part of the state.
Right.
But they'd not reached west yet. They'd not gotten to Kansas City. They didn't really get here until some years later, about another 10 years. But in 1856, there were lots of steamboats on the rivers. They called that the golden age of steamboating because there were so many boats on the river.
Mark Twain, Missouri, So
you could see. And so the Arabia left. It took about 5 days or so to reach Kansas City. Did okay on the first part of the trip. It was loaded, though, points west of here. So when it passed Kansas City, and Kansas City, for your viewers, is on the very far west side of the state of Missouri.
Right.
Okay? So it passed that point, heading up the Missouri. It only went a few more miles and hit a tree on September the 5th, 1856. It was dinner time. The sun was setting. They drove that boat right into this tree that had washed into the river and was buried under the water. You couldn't see the tree.
Kind of like a tree stump.
It was. And the boat ran right into that, poked a hole in the front left side, and it began to fill with water, and it sank quickly.
So was this a passenger boat?
It was. It had
so this carried goods, it carried people. People were just on vacation, just taking a cruise.
Well, maybe. We don't know a lot about the passengers. We found some of their belongings. And people certainly did travel by boat for fun, but most of the people were people moving west.
They were going somewhere.
Going west. They were picking up, and they were going to the frontier, to start a new life out here. And they had everything they owned, on this boat.
Right.
And their most prized possessions, because they don't travel like you and me. They don't move like you and I. When we move today, we fill a loading van full of stuff, and away you go. But back then, they carried their most precious things, put them on the boat, and out they come.
It's interesting, isn't it? So anyway, the boat sank, and nobody died on the boat, apparently. Is that correct?
The Missouri River, while it's a very fast and dangerous river, it's not a deep river.
Right.
It's 12 to 15 feet deep, and steamboats are much taller than that.
Right.
And when it hit the tree and sank, the upper part of the boat remained out of water for a while. So everybody just ran to the top. And they were rescued with a rowboat, a little at a time, one load at a time, took them to shore. They all got there, carrying what they could. Now, for the people who had their luggage in the lower part down in the freight area downstairs, they couldn't get to that.
Couldn't get them.
Filled with water and mud, lickety split, no saving it.
So David, how did you get into all this? I mean, how did you become an excavator and find this and hear about the boat? I mean, how was it discovered?
Well, what seems like at least 2 lifetimes ago, my dad and my mom and myself and my brother were in the heating and air conditioning business. We designed air conditioning systems for homes and shops and repaired them. And I was out at a guy's house working on his air conditioner. This was about 1985.
Wow.
And got it fixed, went inside to talk to the guy. And he had the most unusual room. On the far side of the room that I went into, you could see maps and pictures of old steamboats. And on the left-hand side, he had pictures of flying saucers, where they landed. And on the other side of the wall, there was a full-size cutout of a Bigfoot, Sasquatch or whatever.
Right.
Those things were real too. And he liked to talk about all that stuff. And he did. But he got finally around to talking about steamboats, and that was really what interested me. I didn't care much about the other two.
The Sasquatch, yeah.
I didn't care about that. But I checked out steamboat books, and I called my dad and my brother and said, let's join me for lunch. I got to tell you about this guy that I met. So we went to a little hamburger restaurant and sat down there, and the owner of the place, we knew him, came out and sat down too. And by the time lunch was over, they were saying, Dave, you go find a steamboat, and we'll help you dig it. That's how the search.
So they that started your passion and your pursuit of this, and
like
I guess the rest is history, David.
That's how they say it, isn't it?
Well, how did you find this particular of the Arabia? I mean, what were the events there?
In the search of steamboats, you go to old newspapers and you read old newspapers, and I was looking for a boat. It sank not very far from Kansas City. And so I got into a newspaper of 1856 and came across an article that talked about the Steamboat Arabia. Arabia, spelled just like the country.
So you had to go back into libraries and find these old papers and look on microfiche and all that stuff back in the day, back in the 80s.
Old reels of microfilm, look through all that stuff, page after page after page after page.
Yeah.
And here's this little bitty article. It wasn't very long. It said, large and valuable cargo. Hits a tree, it sinks, no loss of life, boat and cargo totally lost.
Wow.
That's really not all it said. It said also that it sank a mile from a town called Parkville. Well, Parkville, I know where that's at. It's not very far from Kansas City. So I got some old maps of the river from back in those days, and I drew the old map onto a new map.
Oh, my goodness.
See where the river used to be. Because oddly enough, strangely enough, the rivers change course. Now, that's something that folks don't realize. The Missouri River was a very fast river. The sides of the river are fairly soft, a lot of sand,
right.
And the river changes quick and easily. So the river would move, and in this case, it moved a half a mile from the time the boat sank until present day.
Wow.
So I got the map, came down a mile from Parkville, knew where the old river used to be, and then I took a metal detector out with the farmer's permission. And I walked up and down corn rows, back and forth, looking for iron, looking for something that would look kind of like a steamboat underground.
Well, how long did it take you to find it?
Just one day.
You're kidding. So you pretty much pinpointed it pretty quickly.
That was real close. Now, if I'd have started on the far side of the field and walked the other way, it might have taken 2 or 3 days.
Right.
But because I just happened to start here and went that direction to the left, whatever, then it was within the first day.
So what did the farmer with the cornfield say? Did he think you were crazy? Like, hey, I want to dig up your field and find a steamboat.
No, some farmers I've talked to, I've looked for a lot of boats, and some farmers do think you're a little nuts. But this fellow was named Norman.
Okay.
And Norman's great-great-grandpa had owned the farm back in those days. And they knew this boat came up the river and sank. And as the river shifted its course, part of the folklore of his family was the boat was buried somewhere under that farm that had once been river that now belonged to them.
Wow. So he was curious about it himself.
He'd been curious long before I ever showed up. He'd curious about it as a kid. He'd heard about it. The rumor was the boat was carrying 400 barrels of finest Kentucky bourbon money could buy. And he thought that would still be there. So he said, Dave, if you can find it, I'll let you dig it. So that's when I went looking for it. And I found it.
Wow.
It was in a cornfield.
So how long did it take you to excavate it?
From the time we started until the last artifact came out was 4 months.
Wow.
We did it all in the winter. Now, here in Kansas City today, as I'm speaking to you, it's about 8 degrees above zero. It's cold.
Right.
Very cold that
Why'd
winter.
you do it in the wintertime?
Well, because the artifacts coming out of the ground need to stay cold. The heat of the summer would damage a lot of things.
Right.
And the ground that we're digging is not stable. And we're going to go down 45 feet to get to this boat. And so the walls have got to be frozen in place so they don't cave in on you.
Gotcha.
And don't flood. The river don't flood in the wintertime. And there's no bugs in the wintertime. And the farmer don't need his crops, his farm in the wintertime.
Yeah,
So
that is so interesting. I mean, it's such an interesting way of life. There's so many things that we have just forgotten in our modern culture. Man, I just want to encourage our visitors to go check out this Arabia exhibit there in downtown
Kansas City.
In downtown Kansas City, Missouri. And man, it sounds like it's a great attraction, and I think people will really be interested. You can also find David's more information about the Arabia exhibit at 1856.com. I have with me David Hawley here on Life's About Living. Once again, just to remind you that you can subscribe to this by texting LAL to 66866, and that will get you into all of our videos and podcasts and everything on Life's About Living. David, it's been a real honor to have you on this session. We're going to have some more sessions with David, and we're going to ask him some more questions about this very interesting exhibit and the old riverboat Arabia. Thanks for being on the show, David.
Thank you very much for the invite.